I'm really excited about this study in Ephesians. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're in this book. A couple things. As a church, in our time of transition, in our time of moving forward with this vision, I think Ephesians has been just a perfect, not only encouragement, it's been giving us some insight, but also it's been just reassuring that each and every one of us have a part. And that it's not about a leader or a person, it's about people. It's about you working together, and as we work together, and as we move together, we represent his body. And it's been a beautiful story over the last couple of weeks as we've looked about, because of what Christ has done, because he's an ascended king, and because he has captured the enemy, and that he has now given gifts to his people. This beautiful story, because of that, and because of what he does, he has now given us a way to live. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So let's pray, and then we're going to look at Ephesians 4, starting in verse 17. So Jesus, as we look at your word this morning, Lord, what we're going to pray is that this would speak to the reality of our hearts today. Lord, that you would give us comfort, but also realize that you have provided a way for us. And Lord, because of the gospel, the news about what you've done, it impacts us in personal ways, in deep ways. So Jesus, I'm just going to pray that you would calm our hearts and focus our eyes on you. And Lord, that we would trust you because, Lord, you have given all things for us. And Lord, you're doing a great thing in our lives and through us. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so Ephesians 4, starting in verse 17, and we're going to read to verse 24. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So this morning, I believe the text shows us three things. I think the gospel speaks about our past, it teaches us about our present, and gives us hope for the life ahead. So the three things that I see what Paul is doing here is that the gospel speaks about our past, it teaches us about our present, and gives us hope for the life ahead. Part of counseling and working with people that are in conflict, one of the challenges when you have two people that have a lot of tension between them, one of the challenges and things that you try to do is you try to teach them something. You try to teach them perspective. Perspective's kind of an interesting concept. When you're in a battle or you're in a tight place of tension, all that you see ahead of you is narrow, and there's no widening. It's just a really kind of focused point of energy. I remember watching a kids movie called Ratatouille. Anybody seen that? It's about a rat who controls a human to make really good food, and it's French, so that's why, I guess. And so the movie Ratatouille, this chef makes this really great food controlled by a rat, and that's pulling his hair. It's really kind of interesting. It's a fascinating movie. The rat talks too, so it's really good. But in the movie, there's this critic. Ego is his name. They properly name him. And Ego comes to this Chef Gusteau's restaurant. Gusteau is done. This is his son, and the son's being controlled by a rat. It's a Disney movie, okay? So Ego comes up to him and says, what I'm going to give you is perspective. Everybody thinks you're great, but what I say about you will be your perspective. And he goes on about talking about his critic, his ability to analyze. He's a food expert, and he's going to give him perspective. Perspective is something, when we see it, makes sense of a lot of things. When you're in a great deal of pain, or you've been through some level of trauma, the only thing that you could see is the object of that moment. You can't see before it, and there's no way you can see ahead. And so what I think Paul is doing here in the text, he's giving us a level of perspective. Now, how can he do this? He can give us perspective. He's writing to a group of Christians, and he goes, the perspective I'm going to give you is that I'm going to have you take a step back, and I want you to see the full picture of where you've come from. It's a perspective of the past. So what he does here in verse 17, so I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do. Don't be confused with this word Gentiles. It just really means people. There was Israel, the people of God, and then there were the foreigners or the Gentiles. And what he's saying is the people here in this letter are more than likely Gentiles. They're non-Jewish. And what he says, no longer live as the people of the world. The people of the world. How do they live? In the futility of their thinking. In the futility of their thinking. In Hebrew thought, there is no word for the word brain or mind. They don't have that word. Instead, what they do is they talk about the seat of your thoughts is in your heart. And when it writes here in the New Testament, what he says here is the futility of your mind. Now, you might think, well, in the Old Testament it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The word mind really means muchness, with your muchness. That's what it means. But what he's saying here is, and what he's getting at, is the futility of their mind, the perspective he's giving them. The mind here means your intellect, your understanding. It is part of the human system that initiates thoughts and attitudes. Your thoughts, what you think about. And so what he's saying is, you are no longer to live in the futility of your thoughts. What does he mean by futility? The word means worthlessness or good for nothing. So what he's saying is, people of the world live in the worthlessness of their thoughts, the frustration, the good for nothing of their thoughts and their attitudes of their heart, their intent, their imagination. What Paul is saying is that people live in this frustration, this tension. A question that they might say is this: why does anything matter? We live today, we die tomorrow. What does it matter? The futility of their thinking. There's no purpose in this life. The book of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon, as he writes, he speaks to these questions that we ask as people. This is what it says, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labor at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea. The sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. So I think what Paul is addressing is this. The common question, the futility of our thinking that we as people ask ourselves is, why does it matter? What's the purpose of life? And I think any rational person that lives on this planet, you're asking yourselves that question. Why does it matter? And what he's saying is, Paul says is, do not live in a way where the question of meaningless grips you, the purposeless, worthlessness of your thoughts. I've never read his book, War and Peace, but there was a Russian writer named Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy. I've read a couple of his books, and this is what he writes in his book called A Confession. Tolstoy had 14 children, was at the top of his game as a writer, was a brilliant writer. Tolstoy had a large family, a large estate, and this is what he writes about in his book. My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, from the foolish child to the wisest elder. It was a question about answering which one cannot live, as I have found by experience. It was, what will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Differently expressed, the question is, why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It can also be expressed thus, is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? So Tolstoy is being honest with us. He's being honest with himself. He goes, what's the point? He later would write, he would say this, I could give no reasonable meaning to any single action or to my whole life. I was only surprised that I could have avoided understanding this from the very beginning. It had been so long known to all. Today or tomorrow, sickness and death will come. They've already, to those I loved or to me, nothing will remain but stench and worms. Sooner or later, my affairs, whatever they may be, will be forgotten, and I shall not exist. Then why go on making any effort? How can men fail to see this? And how go on living? This is what is surprising. One can only live while one is intoxicated with life. As soon as one is sober, it is impossible not to see that it is all a mere fraud and a stupid fraud. That is precisely what it is. There is nothing either amusing or witty about it. It is simply cruel and stupid. In Tolstoy, what he's getting at is this. When we are to move on in life, we are here but a vapor. When our time is gone and when history happens, the sun will burn out, the earth will go cold, and what's the point of even trying? So all the work that I do today, all the work that I did yesterday, it amounts to nothing. It amounts to nothing. And I think what happens here is that Tolstoy, he died in 1912, I believe, he is being honest. He is saying that in the futility of my thinking, I realize that the big question of meaningless is the true. It's meaningless. So what Paul says is the questions that people, the Gentiles, ask themselves, the futility of their thinking is, why does anything matter? Why can't I just live the way I want to live? The second thing Paul brings up in verse 18, he goes, they are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. So what he says is this. Not only in our thinking is everything meaningless, but this has transferred to our relationships. As he mentions here the relationship, Paul notices the darkening has come. Think of it as a dark cloud that envelops you. You can't see forward. You can't see back. You can't see to your left or to your right. The darkening, in a way, when it comes, it obstructs what we see and what we experience. And because of that, the collateral damage is that our relationships are broken. When you think about all the effort we go into putting into relationships, the sacrifice, the time, and for what? To be rejected? To be not loved? Why? And what he's saying here is that the Gentiles, the people of the earth, ask the big question, why does it matter? And what they experience is separation. always trying to gain in relationships what they really, really need, but never coming to fulfill it. It's like a cloud, a dark cloud, and it surrounds them. Romans chapter 1 says this, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Romans 1:21. So not only do they ask the big questions, not only does darkness penetrate their relationships, causing them to long, but they're separated, but they're longing for something. The third thing Paul talks about is this, verse 19. "Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed." What Paul says in the perspective that he gives, because of what the gospel has done to us, we now have this perspective of our past. We asked the big questions and everything was meaningless. Our relationships were darkened and our separation was real. And then what he says is, we were held captive by what we call freedom. So what do I mean by that? If you look at what he's saying here in the text in verse 19, he says, having lost all sensitivity, the sensitivity being burned, essentially, they've given themselves over to sensuality as to indulge in every kind of impurity. And Paul says is, what I know about the past, what I know about how we used to live is this, that things have captured us. That these things, because the issue is not that I have passion, not that I want affection and love, not that I desire relationships, though because it's broken, what we've done is we have looked for other things to give us significance, and we have been captured by those things. They take a hold on you as if you are being controlled by those things. They grip you. And he goes, what happens is you feed it and indulge into it, but you're never free. And so what we say in our day and age is the truest place we can be is expressing ourselves for who we are. You see what we're doing is essentially saying is, I am trapped. I'm trapped in this world. I'm trapped in my mind. I'm trapped in my body, which I don't like. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to feel the full expression of myself, and I'm going to pursue freedom. I'm going to get out of all the rules. I'm going to get away from everything. And when I find myself, then I'll truly be free. What Paul is saying is, when you feed those relationships and you feed, what you're doing is actually getting the death grip of these things that are owning you are getting tighter and tighter. The chain's getting tighter and tighter. Let me give you an example of how this works. So a couple years ago, my grandfather, he's 94 years old. He was a doctor in St. Pete. And so I'd met people growing up that would say, oh, I know your grandfather. He cared for me. So my grandfather would always do, every year, he would go to Alaska. It was kind of his thing. And he would go fishing out in Alaska. And so my grandfather's 94, realizes he doesn't have much time on the earth anymore. And he said, you know what I want to do is I want to have my family experience this joy that I've experienced for the last 50 years in this great frontier. He loved traveling and things like that. So he's like, I want all my family to go. And so we kind of did this once in a lifetime trip with our grandfather, and we went to Alaska. So here we are in the middle of nowhere. I mean nowhere. There is the weirdest thing when we landed on this airway, because there's more airplanes in Alaska than all of the United States combined, these little commercial jumper planes. There's more in Alaska than all of the rest of the U.S., these little Cessna 170s and stuff. So we land in this place, and all they are these modular, like, mobile home type things in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I'm talking, nowhere. And so you land, if you get sick or something, good luck. If a bear bites you, good luck. And so we're out there, and what he would do is he'd go fishing. That was kind of the thing. And so we were right there by the Bering Sea. So the fish, the salmon would come into the Bering Sea, and they would swim up into these rivers. Meantime, there's also a ton of bears in there too. So we saw every morning see bears on the bank. So we're there, and so one of the things that we do is fishing. You'd go out every morning, and so these fish really haven't been exposed to humans that much, okay? The canning factory that was there burned down, and so these fish have just been doing their thing. They're swimming up the river, they lay their eggs. It's actually a really fascinating ecosystem up there, how everything kind of feeds into itself. And so what we do is we'd spend all our days go fly fishing. So you take a fly rod, which, you just take a fly rod and you're fishing. I'm not really good at fly fishing. I don't even remember which hand to do it from anymore. So you do that, and we look so goofy out there. We had all this clothes on, and we're out there fishing. We didn't know what we were doing. The guy just shaking his head. But what I know, one thing, here's the deal. There are thousands of fish that swim up there. Silver salmon is what we were going for. Thousands of fish. At one point one year, they said you could actually walk on the backs of the fish because they were so stacked up in these rivers. And so you're there and you're fishing, and here's what I would notice. A fish that made it through the Bering Strait, the Bering Sea, lived out there, it fed out there, got large, coming into this thing, it made all this journey, was going against different odds. You see these fish have these claw marks from sea lions and all these other predators trying to eat them. So they come all the way in, and here's the deal. You'd catch a fish, and what you do is you take it and you lift it out of the water. And when you lift it out of the water, you start to see its gills going back and forth. The fish has lived a life, it's done all these things, it's coming up here to lay its eggs, but then, without the restrictions in its life, is about to die. Why is that? Because it's not in its habitat, it's water. And here's the point. Fish, when they act as fish and they thrive as fish, they have to thrive in restriction. The fish cannot say, I want to be free. I want to express myself, so I'm going to jump on the bank. And when it does, and it jumps on the bank, the bear eats it, and it instantly dies. And here's the whole point. The whole point is that fish, not only to thrive, but to flourish, have to live in restrictions. The restriction is water. If it gets out of the water, it will die. And so when we say is, we will truly find freedom by the absence of restrictions, you are the fish. You will die. And what Paul is saying is, what you don't realize is you have been captured. You have been captured by your own passions, that you're on the bank and you're dying. You're dying. The gospel speaks about our past, and it teaches us about the present. Verse 20. That, however, is not the way of life you learned. When you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. So what does he mean here? Christianity, it involves hearing something. And look at what he says. Verse 21, when you heard about Christ and were taught in him. Faith involves a person. So when you ask yourself, what's the purpose of life? How do I mend relationships that I'm designed to live? Paul says, let me tell you about a person. And when you heard about that person, something about the truth of that person and what he's done changes your life. So here's the image. 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked on the earth. Jesus taught people. He lived the life that each and every one of us should have lived. He lived that life 2,000 years ago. The news about that, what he did, he rose from the dead. The news about that event has come. The news travels. It's like sound waves coming in. It hits you. And what he's saying is, when you heard about the news, okay, when you heard about the news, truth came. It made sense of everything. What's the purpose of life? It's in a person. What's the meaning of life? How do I mend these relationships that I'm designed to live in? How do I do all this? How do I live the life that I'm supposed to live? And I'm frustrated that I can't do it because I constantly have this tension in my imaginations and I can't win. And what Paul says is when he speaks about the present, he speaks about news of the event. When it penetrates, he goes, you heard about Christ. They never saw him. When you heard about it, truth came. Truth came. And when truth came, it revealed to you. It revealed to you who you are. It revealed to you that you ask questions and they're not answered. It revealed to you that there is an answer to the question. And when that truth comes to you, it changes you. It penetrates deep inside of you. And he goes, what happened is when you heard about Christ, you responded in something called faith. Faith, Tolstoy will talk about it a lot. He noticed that the peasants in Russia, he noticed that the peasants had a resolve about them. And he also noticed that their resolve had this heavy grip of faith. Faith in what Jesus has done brings change to me. And that's really what the gospel's about. It's the news about the event that comes to me and brings change. Verse 22, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So the gospel speaks about our past, it teaches us about our present, and gives us hope for the future. How does it give us hope? What these verses say is you were taught in regard to your former way of life, and you were taught to put off the old self. And then in verse 23, I'm not sure why they translate it this way, but this is what it literally means. It says, to be made new. It really is the word renewed. It says this, renew, instead of the word attitude, I don't know why they did that either, but it should be the word spirit. Renew, he renews the spirit of our minds. That's what he's saying. I think the attitude's trying to capture some other idea in it, but what really it's the word pneumatos, it's the word spirit. So what is happening? He says that we have a responsibility moving forward. Our responsibility is not only to realize our past, is to understand our present, and by faith we believe him. And he's brought change to us. But our future is not only recognizing our past, but realizing that moving forward, the way we have a hope is that there is a renewal in the spirit of our mind. In our attitudes, in our thoughts, there's renewal. Who's causing the renewal? God's causing the renewal. But here's the deal though, it's a working together. It's not this thing of, okay, God's got it, and I'm just going to do whatever I want in my mind in my life. And it's not my ability to say, well, I'm going to stand up against every thought. I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and I'm going to pull myself up. And that's not what it is either. It's a partnership. I mean, if you looked at earlier, when he says is, you've actually been separated from God in your darkness. What he's saying is Christianity is not the separation, but the bringing together. It's coming together. And when it comes together, there's a responsibility that you have to put off. But realize that what he is doing this fundamental change because of this truth called renewing the spirit, the animating principle of your life, renewing the spirit of your thoughts, renewing the spirit of your imaginations. And what you see is a partnership working together. And so the hope for the future is that God is not going to give up on what he says he's going to do, but he wants me to work and us to work together. And as I put off things, he is actually renewing He's renewing. He's renewing. And what is he renewing me towards? What's that future hope? Verse 24. And to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So what is he doing? What he's saying is that his heart and his passion is to take the gifts and the things that he's created us with, that he's gifted us, and he wants us to live in a way we are like him. Colossians chapter 3, Paul writes about this in verse 10. And having put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. So what is he saying? He's saying his passion, the passions that we have for relationships, the passion that we have to think and to know, and all these things. He goes, God is renewing you in himself. And what he's doing as he's renewing you, as he's doing this work in you, he is making you like himself. He's making you like himself. And when we put off and we allow him to renew the spirit of our mind, as we walk forward, there's a hope that will be like him. Here's the problem, though. Here's the problem. We don't do that. We choose to allow the corrupt nature, the death grip of indulgences, things that we want to do, take and hold us. And so what ends up happening is we are constantly, as Christians, in tension. There's constantly tension. And you know where that tension lives? In your imagination, in your heart. There's thoughts, that tension, you know what you should do, and you know that you shouldn't do certain things. But what happens is there's things that say, if you do that, it'll give you value. So what happens is you work, but when you work for the pleasure of your boss. And when he says you've done a good job, you feel like you've done a good job. And when he tells you you've done a bad job, even though you've done all that you can, you feel devastated. You feel crushed. The relationships that we're naturally supposed to have between husband and wife and children, and what happens when your kid tells you, I really hate you. The nature of you, the friction of when people tell you in your relationship, your marriage is in a really bad position and place. The tension of what you know you're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to be doing with your thoughts. It feels like you can never win. It feels like you feel overcome. You don't feel renewed. You feel this sense of bondage. And what I'm saying is in Christianity, there's a tension that constantly happens. And what he's saying is that you have a response in that tension. And here's the thing. Let me just kind of explain to you how I deal with this tension in my own life. And I think what Paul is trying to show us here, he's trying to give us perspective. When I'm in that moment of tension and I'm fighting myself, I realize this. I realize that the way I live and the thinking that I'm thinking, this is my past. The thoughts of what happened or things that I've done. And I think to myself, God, how could you ever love me because of that? And things that maybe I'm doing or feeling right now, you know what I do? I confess. I confess my sin. Confession is recognizing the pain of the past and bringing it to him and say, I confess the things that I've done. And what he does, you know what he says is, I'll forgive you. And one of the things that we need as people is to be forgiven. So confession is me recognizing the tension. The second thing that I recognize is we confess to one another. We find people in our life that we can trust. And even at the end, sometimes it's hard, but we confess to them. We don't expect them to understand us or even to say, hey, I'm sorry. Sometimes they might totally reject what you're saying. But we learn to confess our sin. Another area is this in the idea of renewing our mind. The way that what I do every day, it's a practice that I do, is not only when I feel the tension in my head, I feel the tension in my heart, Jesus, I confess to you. I confess to you that there are things that are holding on to me that I need to give to you. The second thing I do is I preach the gospel to myself. Let me break that down, because you might not understand what I'm saying. 2,000 years ago, there was an event in history. In that event in history, what happened is Jesus rose from the dead. When he rose from the dead, he conquered Satan. He gave life and gifts to his people. And what he says at that is, because of this decisive moment, I accept you. I can't accept you. You know why? I've dealt with it. I dealt with all your pain. I've dealt with your problems. I've dealt with your past. And here's the deal. The news of what he's done comes to me, hits me in my chest, and I say, that's who I am. I'm not what these people say I am. I'm not what I'm allowing myself to think who I am. I'm not who I am in my job. I'm not who I am in these other relationships. Who I am is that I've been accepted and I've been loved deeper than any other relationship can give me. And so when I preach the gospel to myself, I think of the beauty of what Christ has done, and I allow it to penetrate me and say, this is who you are. You were an orphan, but now you're a son and a daughter. You were an enemy, but now you're a friend. And I know that he'll stick closer to me. He'll walk beside me, even though it doesn't make sense. And at times when I'm in a struggle and a battle, he's not left me. He sees it. And what it helps me to do is to confess quicker. It helps me to recognize him more. And in the battle, in the heat of it, if I feel overwhelmed, I know that he's with me. And so the beautiful thing about what Paul is saying is putting on the new self is a recognition of who he is and what he's done. And so here's what I'm going to ask as we close. I'm going to ask us. I'm going to ask you. Maybe you struggle with the big questions in life. Maybe everything, as Tolstoy said, or as Solomon said, is meaningless. Maybe that's you. Maybe you were brought here to church this morning. You were brought here. Somebody brought you here, and these are questions that you've thought about. Why does it matter? It doesn't matter. And what I want to say to you, it does matter, because there's a hope and there's a future. You can't realize it. You don't see it. But there's a hope and a future, and it's found in a person. He's gifted us himself. And so maybe this morning for you, you need to accept that. You need to allow the questions of your heart to be answered. And you know what? You're not going to find it in self-help or in philosophy. You're going to find it in a person. Not in a concept or an idea, but in a person. And the second thing is, for those right here this morning that are struggling, the imaginations of your heart are wild. It's like a Wild West scene. You fight them, you struggle, but you lose all the time. I want to let you know today that God is there for you. He's with you in that battle. He's with you. He has not left you. And when you allow him to renew your mind, and by faith, you trust and you confess to him, realize he hears you. He does, and he'll forgive you. So what I'm going to ask is this. If that's you this morning, I'm going to ask you by faith to stand up. To stand up. To stand up. And by standing up, what you're saying, listen, I have questions that I can't come to the answer to. I have questions about my past that don't make any sense. Or maybe you're in a struggle right now and you can't get out of it. By standing up, I just want to pray for you. I want to pray for you that God will give you the strength this week, today. And that in the imagination of your heart, you'll start to feel renewal. You'll start to feel his presence. Let's pray together. So Jesus, I know that you love us, and because of that, you give us strength to stand for today. Jesus, I know what you've done for us is you took my sin upon you. Lord, stuff that happened to me or things that I have done, you've taken. And I know what you want to do is you want to bring us together as sons and daughters. So I pray as a church that you would renew our thinking, you would renew our mind, that you'd give us strength. And when we are in those battles in our mind, in the battles of our heart, we confess. We renew our thinking by thinking about you, thinking about what you've done. So Jesus, we give you the people that have stood by faith. The battle's real, but you are for us. You are not against us. In the moments that we feel the weakest, you're there by our side. So Jesus, be with us. Encourage us this morning. Give us strength for today. Help us to see the past is the past. You've done great things in the present, and that the future, no matter what happens, Lord, you're there with us. In your name we pray.